Hello viewers, Mike here. Welcome back to Mac Truck Bookstop. And today I'm going to be discussing The Guardian of the Word by Camara Laye. Today's review, I want you to think of it not as a discussion of this particular version of the book, but a review and analysis of the Sundiata, which is a West African epic, if you haven't heard of it, passed down through oral tradition and recorded by a number of different translators. There's a few versions out there. This one is actually particularly hard to find and not as well known. And as a weird story about how I actually got this one, um, when I was doing my research for, I went down a whole Excel list for every single country, finding at least one idea, an author for each country that I could. And this one came up, Camara Laye came up as one of like the country's best authors, but more well known for another work called Radiance of the King, which I was really torn between that one and this one. When I was looking at like on Goodreads comparing them, and I just Radiance of the King sounded really interesting and really good, but I was more drawn to this book because it deals with there's a plane. It deals with like that oral tradition and an epic of West Africa that I'd never heard of, and I was like, wow, how have I never heard of this Sundiata? Maybe a lot of people don't know about this. Well, it turns out there are more commonly known versions out there that you can get of this, and I can't speak to those, but from what I've been able to deduce, they all pretty much follow the same storyline with a few subtle differences. Basically, I got this for $10, and it was like the only copy left for that price, and now I looked online and like all the copies are $40. So if you want to get this actual version, it might be difficult. But the other versions that exist, D.T. Nyan, 120 pages, published in 1960, called Sundiata, Sundiata, an epic of Old Mali, and Sunjata, which is a Penguin Classics version, and you can get both of these for like $18 on Amazon. 160 pages by Bamba Suso, who's I think the original oral storyteller, the same one that this author worked off of, and Bamu Kamude or something like that. I can't read my own handwriting. Then there's another one called Sonjara. I didn't really look if that's widely available. Son-Jara. It's spelled differently, and there are graphic novels as well out there that are both inspired by and based on this exact story. Though I don't know if they are done by people from Africa. I think they might. I don't know. I didn't look into it, but this is for the country of Guinea or Guinea or Guinea, depending on your language, how you pronounce it. Not to be confused with like the three other countries that have that in their name. Just the Guinea. So it's this West African nation was actually part of the old Mali Empire, which was one of the greatest empires, or the greatest empire of medieval Africa. And this epic tale recounts the founding of the empire and the story of its first great king and founder named Sundiata. And it's done much, you can almost imagine, in the same way as like the Iliad and the Odyssey in ancient Greece were being told 600, 700 years after the events supposedly happened in the story, the Trojan War, if it even happened at all. This we actually know happened and wasn't recorded until similarly 600 and 700 years later after the Mali Empire. This stuff wasn't written down from these performances that oral storytellers gave. until the 20th century. So it's a really kind of an interesting comparison there, I think, as far as like the story wise. It's quite different, of course, from the Odyssey or the Iliad, but it feels very epic, and it was a really outstanding read. I flew through it in 2 days, and of course, there were a lot of like cultural things I had to get used to, such as people having a double, which relates to like their animal totems, and some of the religious and cultural aspects. Like there's polygamy in the book, and just like pretty much all ancient epics. I mean, you're dealing with a culture that's quite sexist, or has quite defined male and female roles. Yet, despite that, and despite the fact that there's some very like raunchy scenes in this epic, which again I can't speak to if they are in the other versions or not, but this is a highly mature rendition of the epic. You have very detailed and important scenes of copulation after a wedding, for example, and a man kind of trying to make a woman submit. So if those kinds of things would make you uncomfortable, then just stay away from, I guess, ancient literature in general. Because, like in the Iliad, the story starts out with Achilles crying to his mommy because Agamemnon took his slave girl away. So, it's all over. But the fact is, this it also has some really important, one specifically really important female protagonist, which is the mother of Sundiata, the king of Mali to be. And she is actually such a central role in the story. Um, I almost felt for most of it that I was reading the story of Sogalan, which is her name, more so than the story of Sundiata, because she is the one who is by like prophesied to. She's described as very ugly and having a hunchback, but she's prophesied to be the mother of the greatest king that has ever been. And so she is coveted at first by two hunters who are unable to dominate her, and then later she births Sundiata with a local king who the hunters bring her to. So I guess from this point on, there's going to be some spoilers. So if this sounds interesting to you, like something you want to read, you can either watch the rest of the video or not. I think in the same way that, knowing the story of an ancient epic sometimes might even help you understand it as you read it and get into the nuances. So personally, it didn't bother me that as I was reading this, I tried to look on YouTube and listen to some podcasts and things to try to understand the story better, and to so that I could dig more into the details as I was reading it. So feel free to listen to the rest of the video and just deal with the spoilers. It's the story, as you can imagine, you already know it's about the founding of the Mali Empire, so you know Sundiata is going to come out victorious. But the major villain of the story doesn't really surface until like over halfway through the story, at least in this particular version. But it sounds like in the other versions as well. He is like this sorcerer, and now I understand why one of the reviews kind of said this reminded them of Lord of the Rings, because he's like this sorcerer king who's like conquering all the lands, right? And all the other kings, and there's some like grisly descriptions. Like he builds a big tower, and inside this tower he's got like 10 skulls or heads of other kings he's conquered. So this guy's set up as the villain that Sundiata has to defeat to reclaim, to become king of the land that he's prophesied to be. And Sumaro is his name. It almost sounds like Sauron or Saruman. I don't know. Sorry, I don't mean to say this is like Lord of the Rings, because it's not. But there is some parts of it, and then there's this big battle. You know, it's really epic at the end. But the book really kind of goes in three parts, or I can break it down into three parts. The first part is kind of like the introduction, and you have your typical, like, you have a really cool opening, like this James Bond battle scene with this woman who turns herself into a buffalo, which turns out to be the double of Sogalan, who's the mother of the the protagonist Sundiata. And so you have this cool James Bond like hunt of the buffalo to open it up, and these two hunters are really, they turn out to be minor characters in the long run, but they bring Sogalan to where she needs to be. Once Sogalan is with this king, you have this whole kind of like soap opera like middle of the book where Sogalan is the protagonist and really makes the other wife of this king quite jealous, and there's kind of this family struggle, and this wife is doing everything she can to like curse Sogalan and curse her child because she's, you know, this king has two wives now, and you can imagine that just like in real life, many times polygamy didn't work out too great as far as the wives liking each other, which it's an interesting contrast, for example, to Things Fall Apart, uh, which was, you know, set in Nigeria by Chinua Achebe, that I reviewed some videos back, where actually you did see cases where the wives got along pretty well. So it was kind of interesting to see the other side of this in a myth, in this mythic story. Now the performances of these are really interesting. If you can, check out on YouTube how the performances were, because like the oral storytelling is like really powerful. And one thing I do like about this book is that whenever there's like a poem, the poem is always written in the original language, or how you would pronounce it in the original language of the people from this area, and and then the English will be below it. They don't even really try to translate it poetically because there's no way. So they just let you read it poetically in the original language and then understand what it says. Um, Another thing I should say, this version, as opposed to the others, is not translated directly into English. This is an English translation of the French translation of this story being told orally. So the story was told orally by these people called griots or griots, and they are also, it's an old position. So in the Mali Empire and before, these griots acted as not only storytellers and people who remembered the stories and passed them down, but also as mouthpieces of powerful people. Um, Whenever the king had to give a speech or an announcement, it's these griots who would do it. They were basically the mental librarians of the kingdom. They were advisors, musicians, dance. It's like they were performers. It was like there's no real translation of all the things that a griot was. Um, I digress. So these performances are really interesting, and so this was originally given as a performance or told, and there's even a part in the beginning of this edition that tells how they, you know, went and found one of these griots. They paid him, and and the first time they tried it didn't work out, but then they were able to connect with him once he trusted them, and it's like you had to not act like you were anybody too important, like a politician or anything, or they would not trust you and would not tell you the story. So they guard this stuff pretty tightly, at least in the time this was written, which is 1970s. Um, and it was the last thing Camara Laye wrote before his death as well. So that's something to keep in mind. But back to some of my thoughts on the story. I just wanted to give that background. If you're interested in this, which you should be, because I consider this, if you want, not this edition necessarily, but the Sundiata, find a version of the Sundiata, and just to understand some of the mythology of West Africa, because it is quite, there's no reason for this not to be taught alongside all of the other myths that are taught wherever they should be, like in universities or schools or whatever. I mean, this is as close to the literary canon of West Africa as you can possibly get. The foundation for stories being told throughout. And who cares if it wasn't written down? I mean, um, the Iliad and the Odyssey were meant to be spoken out loud, not read in their day. So it's still part of the literary canon, and it's on the same level, and it's the same level of myth. It's not just folk tales and myth are at the same level in this case. And so I feel passionately that anyone who wants to be widely read, anyone who might be following this series or watching this video because they're interested in reading more of the world, that you need to read a version of the Sundiata. And again, this one's hard to find, but there's other versions out there. So there's there's a ton of psychological wisdom in this book about people, their development, the struggle for the birth of Sundiata is so, like, Sundiata isn't even born until like halfway through the story, and it's just the struggle of Sogolan to get to the point of having this child. And even when Sundiata is alive, he's being helped by all these other people constantly. Sundiata does not do it himself. He's got this whole network of support around him. In many ways, just like all of the mythic characters, Sundiata exists less than the people who help him, because the ideal is always less real than the people who are actually making it happen. And the birth and growth of Sundiata is just this monumental mythic struggle that's shared by both mother and son. And then, of course, the defining moment of the book, when Sundiata is actually born, he can't walk. And everyone's like, well, this prophecy is bunk. This king to be supposedly can't walk. But then one day, after years of care by Sogolan and hatred and mockery by the other jealous wife and others, he gets up and miraculously walks with the help of a steel pole that his best friend goes and has made for him by a local blacksmith. And another interesting aside is that blacksmiths, it kind of seems, are also considered to be like sorcerers in this context, or performing a kind of magic. There's a really interesting thing with that. Or at least the language that's used to describe it is interesting. I'm just kind of looking. I took a few notes as I was going through the book, and that's a defining moment in the book. Just that struggle, just so that Sundiata can walk. It takes more than half the book to get to that point, and then the second half of the book is like, just okay, this is how he became the king and won the battle and defeated the evil sorcerer and stuff. So, and that might be off-putting to some people, but I find it to be an incredibly mature way of telling a story like this, because the central action is not even the defeating of the great sorcerer. It's just being born and growing up to adulthood so that you can defeat the sorcerer, which requires the bond and the powerful bond of mother and son. And it's I think it's quite a powerful message about the culture as well that this comes from. And despite all of the sexism inherent in it, I found that this central role that Sogolan played, and many of the female characters having quite a bit of autonomy in the narration, again, at least in this version. I can't speak for other versions, and I don't know how much Camara Laye adjusted the story. All I know is it's heavily based on, it doesn't say it's a strict translation, so he may have made changes, but at least in this version, there's quite a bit of that, you're getting inside their heads, understanding decisions for both sexes. So yeah, apart from that, I don't know how I can try to convince you more. This is, to me, a required reading for somebody who wants to understand literature from around the world. Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure I didn't forget anything from my notes. There's certain parts of the book, like a lot of myths, and this is something I really love about reading the old ancient epics, is that there's always like these little paragraphs that describe something happening that just from that little paragraph you can imagine like a whole other offshoot story being made. A good example of this is there's a part where when this evil sorcerer guy has taken over all the lands from his tower with his armies and executing kings and keeping their heads and stuff. They Everyone's kind of rallying around Sundiata as Sundiata goes out to fight back, and there's a secret mission where 5 members of the court of Sundiata's homeland go to try to find him, and and uh, and then one woman griot. So you imagine this band of 6 people who are journeying around all the land, trying to avoid the henchmen of this evil wizard king conqueror guy, and trying to find Sundiata, that who's in exile. So I don't know. I just thought that was cool. That's one paragraph or a couple paragraphs in the whole book of 220 pages that I could imagine just a whole story around, which is, I love that kind of thing. Yeah, there's a big, there's a lot of themes in this. Just like all of the greatest epics, this contains all aspects of humanity in one way or the other. It encompasses everything because the story is so big, and not only that, but gets into a few of them very deeply and reveals this side of storytelling and the side of human nature that I had never conceived of before, which I've already talked about. And with that, I think I've said all I want to say. I think I should. This book actually got me thinking more and more, encouraged to start a series of videos that are like why you should read X book. And I don't know, maybe do some other series like that, because there's certainly, while I enjoy these kind of rambly videos I do after reading the books, I don't have to put a ton of work into them. It's just kind of a diary entry, so to speak. At some point, I would like to make more focused videos that are like, hey, this is why you should read this book, concisely, point A, point B, point C. And these videos will hopefully inform that, and I can do that kind of with the best books that I find. This is definitely up there on one of my favorites that I've read so far. I definitely rejuvenated me, because I haven't enjoyed a book this much in a few books. So yeah, with that, thank you again for watching, and if you're new, please consider subscribing and joining on this journey. Just a quick reminder of the other books I'm working on, in case you want to hop on these to comment or whatever when I post the video. Pedro Paramo from Mexico. We've got The Bridge on the Drina from Bosnia. Ivo Andrić. Pedro Paramo is by Juan Rulfo. Still working on Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet from Portugal. And Water Margin, or Outlaws of the March from China. We're going to be working on this one for a while. I'm definitely not doing a video on this anytime soon, but it's kind of it's a chapter a day type of book, or even less maybe, but we'll get to it when we get to it. I read a lot and enjoy reading a variety of books at the same time, as you can see. So yeah, thanks again. Take care.